Okay, I said this would be harder, so here it is. I'm going to start, you're not going to be able to do this, but I want you to think about trying to make your drawing about as big as the object appears on your screen. So I'm going to try to stay inside these lines. And then also think about what are some of the proportions of the main landmarks. See, if we were to estimate the size of this, for example, compared to this, which I could do visually by just going 1, 2, 3, I would say that this knob up here is a little less than a quarter of the overall height. Boy, that wasn't too good, was it? But that's how I want you to think about it. So draw a baseline, draw a middle line for the knob, and then top line, and make sure that your ratio is about 1 to 3.5 if you're going to compare this to this. So in my drawing, I'm going to try to use these lines to help me a little bit. I'm going to draw the knob. And I'm going to draw what I call the belly. And I'm going to draw the base. And the bottom curve of that base is going to hit my other line here. Like that. And the advantage of working this way is you can then sort of visually check and make sure that everything's lining up. Like I can take a line from the bottom of this belly, bring it over to here, and say that mine's in about the right spot. I could take a line from where this shadow shape ends here, and I could use that to determine this cast shadow shape here. This is not something that you can always do physically, but you can do it in your head, and that's what I'm trying to demonstrate for you. So now I notice that this knob top thing here is a little wider than it is tall, but not by much. And I notice that it's sort of, if I was to block it out, sort of an octagon shape. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's often good to start thinking of things in straight lines and then making them all curve later. And this starts by going almost straight down and then it swells out and creates this sort of teardrop shape. And a lot of artists find it's useful if you're having a hard time achieving symmetry, to just sort of put a line of symmetry axis down the center of the object, and then you can even measure, make sure things are staying the same left and right. See how that would work. And then I can also notice that, but since this is turned out of a single piece of wood, I should not be surprised to find that the belly is the same across here, is the same width as the base across here. So that means when I draw the base, I want to make sure to keep it the same width, like this. So that's the basic shape. Take your time with that. I'm now going to go straight to shadow mapping, starting with form shadows. So let me slide this over to the left a little. And first form shadow should look familiar to you. It's similar to what we've seen on spheres, with a couple small differences. And this is the first cast shadow. And this is the second form shadow here. And it transitions smoothly into the second cast shadow here. And notice this cast shadow does something interesting. It sort of goes straight or even curves up a little. And then right about here, it goes over that little ledge and takes a little step down. And that's important because that shows the ledge. And then right about here, it transitions into the next form shadow, which curves all the way around to here. And finally, we have the cast shadow on the ground. And in order to do that accurately, I'm going to do a little bit of annotating here. So maybe I can use my tablet through this paper. So what we have over here is a series of ellipses. We've got one here. It's the shadow of the base. And we've got another one here, which is the shadow of the belly. And we've got a last one here, which is the shadow of the head. And we've got the horizon line here. And notice that the horizon line is hitting below, significantly below the belly. So with that in mind, let's see what we can do here. We've got first the horizon line, which is right about here. erase some of this other stuff because it's just throwing me off now. And yeah, let me get rid of this too. Here's the ellipse, which is the shadow of the base. The shadow of the belly is here. And the tricky thing is then getting the shadow of the knob on the top and keeping it within this line. That's really important. Sort of like that. If you do these steps, you're going to get a much better result than if you just try to freehand that. Now I'm going to check my angle. Let's see. See that? That's the angle of the light. And let's see how it looks over here. Pretty close, I would say. Probably just come a little further out on this shadow. Okay, so this being a little harder than what we've been doing, I'm going to just shade this lefty. Please remember to shade the opposite direction for first shading if you are right-handed. And remember, you're just shading right over your edges. See, I don't stop on this line, I just shade right over. And I don't stop on this line either, it's just one big shadow shape. I'm laying in my tone. And notice what happens is we go from seeing a bunch of lines, which are really hard to compare to the original, to what we have now in front of us, which is a pattern of light and dark, which is very easy to compare to the original. Right? It's like, especially if we get it the same size again, we can see that they look pretty much the same. And if yours don't, this is the time to make corrections. Because we haven't done any dark shading yet. We haven't done any dark outlining. So we can see, we can still make corrections. You can erase any of this work very easily. So take your time getting this looking right. And then we're going to do the details. And in order to do that, please pause the video if you're not caught up. We're going to zoom in on this stuff. Okay, so this should be looking to you a lot like a sphere, and the steps are the same. First, erase the shadow map. And then start doing some sharpening strokes on the outside of the form that transition into some soft light to dark transitions on the form. You see that? This is not random, this is not improvised. When you see people draw like this, they're not just like going for it. there's a strategy here. And I'm hatching over this edge to soften it. I'm hatching with that edge to sharpen it. I'm going to hatch over this edge to soften this. Always dark into light, not the other way around, and not scrubbing back and forth. And I'm going to clean some of this up. I want this outline here to be very faint. Why? Because it's a light surface against a light background. It would not make any sense to do a hard edge there. Again, when we zoom in on this even further, this is the edge. It's not standing out anywhere near like this edge is standing out. So we don't want it to compete. See how easy that was? And why am I leaving this alone? Reflected light, right? Right in through here, the coarse shadow gets narrower, like that, but still some reflected light. Then sharpening strokes here, the cast shadow. And transitioning into these strokes, which are going to follow the form downward and just slightly overhang that shadow edge, like that. More sharpening strokes here. If you see an improvement you can make in your outline, you can always do that. Okay. Now while we're up here, we do have this highlight placed right about there. And what we could do is do our halftone shading very, very lightly around that highlight, just to show where it is. But again, halftones cannot compete with shadows. We don't even want them to compete with a reflected light. I want you to be honest with yourself. If I zoom in here, this is the halftone value. I'm sorry, this is the halftone value up here, and this is the reflected light. Are they right here? Are they anywhere near the same value? No. This is way, way darker here than here. Okay, moving down the form. Notice we have a halftone around this highlight too. This highlight is more elongated. So we can just lay in a little halftone around that highlight too. And coming down to here, we've got some nice dark shadows. This approach here is very similar to what we did up here, right? We're just hatching over this edge. I really should have erased the shadow map first. And notice I'm curving this way over here to meet this contour. As I get in the middle, I'm going sort of straight up. And then as I come around here, I'm going to curve just a little bit the other way. And that way, when I end up meeting this contour, I'm already doing my sharpening strokes. Got it? Now, this is really dark in here, but there's still a reflected light. How are we going to achieve that? Not by erasing, but by just going a little darker through this very narrowing kind of core shadow here. You see that? And then underneath that reflected light, we have another darkening. As this surface turns to face the ceiling, it gets darker again, because it's not getting any of that light from the floor. And over here, we're not getting much reflected light. Why? Because the table is partly darkened by the cast shadow. So our reflected light is focused over in here, where the light is bouncing off of this surface. Now, is it possible to draw this without understanding any of these things? Yes, it is. It's just a lot harder to do. It's a lot less fun, and you're never going to be able to express yourself that way. It's just going to be a chore. In the same way that I could sit down and easily, well, not too easily, but I could, without knowing any Chinese, I could sit down and copy out pages and pages of Chinese text. If I was careful enough, I could make something that would be legible to somebody who reads Chinese. But it would not be fun for me, and it would not be beautiful. In other words, it might be a legible copy, but it would not be a fluent copy that'd be fun to either do or to look at. However, if I learned Chinese and understood what I was drawing, I would be able to much more easily create all those forms in a way that would be not only legible, in other words, recognizable to someone else as Chinese text, but also potentially beautiful if I got good at it. In other words, it could be graceful and it could be expressive. If I understood the words, I could even put some feeling into it. None of that is possible if all you're doing is just copying shapes that you don't understand. Okay, you have to get some understanding. Notice that right in here, this little ridge line is just a little lighter than what's around it, right in here. And then it comes around the corner and it becomes just a little darker than what's around it. Here it's even a real shadow. And then it becomes a halftone. And we've got a little highlight here and a little highlight here, so I'm going to do some halftones around those. And mainly what we have left is now the shadow on the ground. So let's be honest with ourselves again. See this edge? Dark against light. Here, light against dark. The same pattern we saw with the spheres. So I'm going to have to create this really dark cast shadow on the ground, which gets very, very narrow through here. I don't think I even remembered to map that very carefully, but I can see it's so narrow, but I can see that it's sort of like just a line, a thick line that comes around here until it gets here and then it disappears. Some art teachers will say there's no lines in nature. To that I say, first of all, if you just want to copy nature, use your phone, and then you won't have any lines. You'll just have pixels. Wouldn't that be easier than drawing? If you're going to draw, guess what? Line is the vehicle of drawing. Line is what drawings are made of because you're moving an instrument across the page with the human hand. You're going to make lines. So lines are not the worst thing in the world for drawing. Furthermore, if there are no lines in nature, there are sometimes linear cast shadows like this. I mean, that's as close as you can get in nature to a line. Horizontal on the cast shadow again. And I'm not worried about staying fussily inside my outlines here. Right? And now I'm going to study this edge. And I can see I have a little problem because this edge isn't coming out in my drawing, so I'm going to darken this side and transition my dark into cast shadow, form shadow, I mean. I'm also going to use my eraser and just bring that light a little higher up into there. So my reflected light is too intense. So notice I'm going to just shade over it here. Not too intense right here though. I need it to stand out more. And I'm going to do that as I always do by just darkening through the core shadow a little bit. Notice also that this cast shadow, as it gets near the wall, in other words, distant from the object, gets very fuzzy. That's what we expect to see. I'm going to erase a little bit of my shadow mapping on the highlights. Clean those up a little. Clean up here. And there it is. It's not perfect. Could go a little darker up through here. A little sharper and darker over here. Maybe a little darker and wider right in here. Now when I'm sort of squinting my eyes a little, I can see that my reflected lights are standing out too much. And that's normal. But look what happens, and when you're a beginner, that's very tempting because you get so much impact out of the reflected lights. You're like, oh, I want to make those really strong. It's going to look cool. But it, it doesn't work to have them stand out too much. So what I do is just go back to my first shading direction and just bring down not just the reflected light, but just shade over this whole area a couple times. And you see it looks a lot more believable. And I'm going to do the same thing down here because this one's also standing out too much. Just sort of unify that whole area. And even this one, too much. So if you liked this, I'm going to post a link to a whole folder of images similar to this. And I'm going to invite you to try doing a couple more on your own. If you are still having trouble with the spheres and the cylinders, I want you to practice on something simple like an egg or a cube. And if you thought that drawing this thing was kind of fun and you were up to it, then try a couple more of the harder shapes. And like I said, that link will be posted shortly. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.